From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
Hey everyone, this is Charlene Buckles.
and I'm Nima Kulkarni.
I know it's been a while, and we are currently working on season 2. But in the wake of Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay shootings, we wanted to go ahead and record this special episode. We felt like we needed to make this space now and process together as an AAPI community. I know this is a developing story, and there's a lot we don't know about the shootings, but we're going to focus on how we feel and not what we know. As some of you all might know, Where Y'all Really From was a podcast that was created by us in the wake of the Atlanta massacre shooting. And now with another act of violence in the AAPI community, we just felt it was necessary to record the special episode. The people who had committed these shootings are 2 elderly male immigrants of Asian descent. One is 66 and the other is 72. And at Half Moon Bay, there were 7 people killed. In Monterey Park, there was at least 11 people who were killed, and there were many more that were injured. And what we also know is that Monterey Park is a predominantly Asian community. I feel like, and we talked about this before, and I'm trying to process it still. I cannot figure out why this feels so differently. We've talked about this too in various group texts and other conversations, but Sandy Hook felt different for me. That was when I was a teacher, and it hit so deeply at that point. Uvalde, when I as a mother of 2, that hit so differently. Atlanta massacre, and the reason why we started this podcast of a shooter that was targeting Asian women in Atlanta, that also hit in a different way. This just feels so different, and I cannot pinpoint why, and I can't pinpoint all the feelings that surround it. But I do think it's just because they were 2 elderly male immigrants of Asian descent in a predominantly Asian community, and that intra-community violence that was happening, it just lands in such a different way.
It does. And I think one of the things that you touched upon is that it's something that occurred within the Asian community. And so there's a lot of initial reactions that people had. Was this a hate crime? Was this something that we should be afraid of? Because we, again, in the wake of the Atlanta shootings, we knew that was at a really sort of peak of anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian violence all around the country. And so was this sort of a repeat of that happening? Was it all happening again? Should our Asian communities be on heightened alert? And one of the things that, you mentioned also is that it's happening at a moment of celebration. It's happening at a moment of real cultural recognition for the Asian community. And at the same time, it's being perpetrated by elders. And, Charlene, you're Filipina, I'm Indian. And all throughout the Asian community, there is a deep-rooted respect for your elders. There is a deep-rooted feeling of affinity to the past and the memories that they hold and their place in our communities. And so one of the things that we're looking at, and this is even explored in Everything Everywhere All at Once, is this idea of generational trauma. Like we don't talk about trauma in that way within our families or maybe even within our communities. And I think one of the things that the reason this is hitting differently and the reason we wanted to do this segment now is because I think we're still processing, and there's a lot of things that everybody's feeling, everybody's reacting to, and everybody is kind of, having a different moment, like it's hitting differently for different reasons, for different even Asian communities, because it's, again, it would be akin to somebody, in a Diwali celebration or some major cultural celebration being really, really tarnished by this horrible, tragic shooting and act of violence that occurred, and we just don't know why.
Right.
And that's something that, and it's something we just don't expect from our elders.
Exactly. And I do think that, again, going back to the celebration, I talked to a friend of mine, in Lunar New Year, at least in the Chinese tradition, there's a lot of firecrackers that happen. And like at first, some people thought it was firecrackers. And they had this, a friend of mine was saying how they were celebrating. Their mom said, don't go into the new year sad. You need to process your feelings later, be happy, and let's celebrate. And they were having firecrackers, and they had, they were expressing all this fear and just anxiety around those loud noises, hearing what happened in Monterey Park. And again, just so many layers to that one little conversation I had with my friend. One, that pressure to put your feelings down, process it later, and move on and go into the new year happy. Also, trying to still be joyful and celebratory and having, go this really important cultural celebration that you're having with your family, but not dealing with the feelings. And I think that is maybe a big theme that I'm finding this week with many of the people I'm talking to, or talking with. But yeah, so I do think I want to explore that a little bit, because we've talked about in many of our conversations in this podcast about our elders and coming to America, and how they, especially our parents, for example, they came at a much older age where they've already been established, in their 20s or 30s, and it's a totally new culture, oftentimes a totally new language, and they experience all this trauma. We then either are born here or are 1.5 generation immigrants, also experience that trauma sometimes of trying to balance both worlds. And I think, at least for our generation, there's an emphasis on mental health. There's an emphasis of taking the pause and being able to rest and process and all those things. I, at least myself, have not had that conversation with my mom of all the stuff they had to go through and all of the bullying and all of the various spaces that they had to face and just smile at, about, getting taunted or what have you, as a first-generation immigrant, and then not processing that because it's not part of our community to talk about feelings.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, that conversation that you had in the immediate wake of this shooting. They're being told to sort of internalize and suppress their feelings, their reactions to this horrible thing that's happened, because of this cultural tradition of going into the new year happy. And I think that kind of encapsulates the Asian community. And I'm just generalizing here, but the idea, we do not just discuss our mental health in the free way that non-Asian communities might. And also generationally, our parents, our grandparents aren't going to be discussing that, because that's not the important thing. They came here, they were the ones that sort of forged the communities. They landed, they made this home for their families. And so when we were born, or when we grew up here, we had a home, we had some level of stability in the United States, right? They made that, they created that. And so whatever they went through was way more, traumatic and way more impactful in their psyche, and yet they don't talk about it because that was not the priority, right? The urgency is getting a home, making sure there's food on the table, making sure your kids are safe, and just, making that stable existence in this new community, in this new country. And so your feelings are not the thing that you're going to be discussing. Your feelings and how you are reacting to any setbacks or any bullying or anything any discrimination that you may have faced, that's not the important thing. The important thing is that you got here and you've made it a success and your family's able to thrive and survive. And I think that is definitely true, certainly even in my family and just in our communities in general. even if you acknowledge that you need help, you're not going to be discussing that with other members of the community. You're not maybe even going to be discussing that with members of your family. And I think that is something that we really need to take a hard look at again, because one of the reasons we're having such a difficult time processing this is A, that respect for our elders, and then B, this feeling of how did we fail them? Because what is this? What were they holding inside that then exploded in this way at this moment of celebration and cultural importance in their 60s and 70s?
Because my therapist will say, if you can compartmentalize all the feelings, but eventually it's going to spew out. Eventually it's going to come out in other ways, right? And so that, I think, is a reality and a gut check. And like you said, like, how are we as the 1.5 generation failing them? And it's really interesting you also made that point too, because I will say that is a really hard question for me because, and to be very vulnerable about it, in my life, I have not had positive male Asian figures. There's only one person out of my uncles and my biological father. All of those things, like all of the people in my life that were male Asians were very traumatizing for me, and we still don't have positive relationships except for my grandfather. And when I saw the first picture that came out of the Half Moon Bay shooter in his hat, and he was, they had just handcuffed him. He looked like my grandfather, and that really messed me up. And I had to, I had to pause about it because I kept thinking, like, what, this could be someone in my family. Of all of the unresolved issues that I have with the male figures in my life, it could have been one of them to do that. Do I have an obligation to help them when I'm still dealing with the trauma that they have inflicted on me, or miscommunication, whatever you want to call it? But I'm still dealing with that. Could I reach out to those Asian male figures who are now older, who are now in their 60s and 70s, to say, like, how can I help you? And that's really hard. That's really hard for me to, like, square that hole because I'm still dealing with my trauma that within those relationships, and so I think it's difficult. And I hear that a lot from, like, a lot of 1.5 generation, and you'll find there's some, there's a lot of, like, Instagram accounts and all these different social media accounts where we are still trying to process our emotions and trauma and generational trauma and balancing all of those things, and yet trying to hold that respect for them and take care of them in such different ways. We're not, and May one of our co-hosts, May, has mentioned this before, of being able to support your family and build like another master suite to make sure your parents are taken care of. I talk to my mom about that all the time. Like, it's kind of a running joke that she'll eventually move in with us. But, like, how those relationships impact my mental health and how I need to have strong boundaries, I'm still dealing with all of that. Like, are we obligated to take care of our elders in that way? Or do we redefine what that looks like and not just have them live with us?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's those are very important points. And, when you mentioned the word obligation, and then you mentioned taking care of them. And I think, of course, in every Asian community, there's an incredibly strong sense that when your parents get older, you're going to be taking care of them, and that's every generation. When your parents get older, you're going to take care of them, whatever that looks like, because a lot of times there's, you might be in one place, but your parents might be back home. And so how do you take care of them there? If everyone's in the same place, what does it mean? What does it look like to take care of them? And then again, going back to, if you're the one supposed to take care of them, then how have you failed these folks where they are having to resort to violence to express something, some trauma that they have been internalizing, and we don't know for how long. And, one of the things that struck me when I was reading about the Half Moon Bay shooter was that he had he had done this thing because he was tired of the bullying that he had endured. And we don't know for how long, because he was 66 years old when this happened. And we talk about bullying in kids, for instance. We talk pretty frequently about that. We also talk about bullying in terms of how it impacts parents, what they should do in teaching their kids, and how to treat other children, right? How do you treat each other? What we don't talk about is bullying in the Asian community in terms of what that looks like and how you deal with that, how you react to that. Because again, it's this idea of, well, you should be focused on school. Nothing else really matters. So those, don't worry about it, or just move on, like move through it, push through it. Because the thing that you need to do is succeed in your education, in your career, whatever it is. One of the things, though, that I also thought about was generationally, we also don't talk about bullying in our older, right, in the previous generation. So in our parents and our grandparents, who may very well have experienced a whole other level of bullying and discrimination that they certainly don't talk about, that we don't talk about, and we don't then talk about how they should deal with it in terms of access to mental health care, or are they able to talk to their families or community members about what they've experienced. We may be able to, right, sitting here, our generation is able to talk about those things and know that it's wrong and call it out when we see it, or learn how to deal with it in our day-to-day if it's something that we're experiencing in microaggressions or something even more overt. But they do not. And they may have experienced it, but they don't know how to talk about it. They don't have that language, and they don't have that comfort. And there's still a stigma attached to it because, again, your role is taking care of your children. And so when the children are now supposed to take care of their parents, how much do we need to talk about the mental health care that they need as well?
Right. Because, again, as you mentioned, we don't know the level of bullying and trauma that they had to endure, that they've tried to hide from us. And again, talking from my own experience, it took my mom a very long time to talk about how we were undocumented. I mean, I had to it was in my 30s when I was like, I need you to tell me about this story because I'm about to join this board and they want to know why I'm joining this board about immigration legal services. And so I really need to know what really happened between the age of 7 to 12 when I was by myself every single day and we had exit plans, and it was really hard. There was a lot of shame in that. And there's, that trauma of having to go through the immigration system, a system that was made to keep immigrants out, the trauma of having to leave your family a half a world away to go into this culture you've never been before, to see snow for the first time and not be prepared to go out in the snow and figure out where to go. All of those driving, she grew up in Metro Manila. And so I think she got her license when she was in her 30s. And so it was they experienced so much of that. Plus, on top of that, the microaggressions that we experienced growing up as well in a predominantly white space like Kentucky, and being what I think one of the terms that Dan uses is being killed with 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's on top of this system that's meant to keep you down. You also have these little pain points throughout. And it bubbles over. And sometimes you see it, and again, something I'm working on in therapy, you see it inside your home and how your relationship then is formed with your parents, and that type of, I don't want to say dysfunction, but it becomes this dysfunctional relationship because the aggression is taken out on you sometimes, or the lack of communication or energy is taken out on you as a child. And then you take that same, and again, this is generalization because I don't know it. There's still a lot of information coming out about these shootings, but it makes me wonder when you say that person was bullied, what it took for them to get to a point to go out and do this. At 66 and 72, when the average mass shooter is usually in a young male, so it's very curious to me, and again, just like a lot to process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because one of the things that we focus on when we talk about mass shootings is this idea that these are young men. They don't have full control, like impulse control, and so they are going to be more reactive, and they're able to, a lot of them live in places with easy access to weapons, and you have to think especially about the Monterey Park shooter. Who had these like high capacity magazines and rifles that would have been very difficult to get in a place like California, which has one of the most restrictive set of gun laws in the entire nation. So there would have been a lot of thought. This was not, neither of these were impulsive acts where somebody got, snapped. This idea of somebody snapped and they just went out and got a weapon or had a weapon already and then went out and started killing people. This took a lot of thought in sort of accumulating the weapons, in getting the plan together. The fact that it happened at on the Lunar New Year during that celebration, I think that is a whole different set of things that we have to process. This idea of these elders being so traumatized and then turning that into this external aggression, which we also don't necessarily associate with our elders. Because it would have taken a lot of calculation and thought to have this occur at the time that it did and the way that it did. And again, that shooting resulted in 11 deaths and a lot more wounded. So it was pretty devastating. And it's just a whole other layer that's added to this conversation that we also don't necessarily talk about, because how are we allowing this to happen and sort of fester to that point?
And that, I think, goes back to your really interesting question and expanding it more of how are we taking care of our community, not just of our elders, but of our AAPI community, one that is many, many cultures that are so different but yet very similar experiences. And I think that's just one of the questions I'm still trying to process. How are we showing up for our community in that way, not gaslighting their experience and really supporting them? Because at the end of the day, we're the only ones that we got.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly true. And I think one of the things that we have to really take a hard look at is when we are talking about taking care of our elders, when we are talking about taking care of our communities, that we who have the capacity, even though we're sort of still processing some generational issues and we're still processing, navigating being AAPI in a predominantly white culture, certainly here in Kentucky, what are we doing? What resources are we providing? What is the language and the space that we are allowing for our community members, for our family members, just to talk about it, to take that on proactively and connect folks with resources? Because I think that it's now clear that it's incumbent on us, no matter what else we have going on, what else we're processing, that we're the ones that are going to have to create that space. We're the ones that are going to have to break that stigma and that cycle of just silence and suppressing your feelings and moving through it, moving past it. And we're going to have to just add that in our list of sort of, taking care of our communities and our family members, because this is a clear, I think, example and reason of why we cannot ignore the mental health of our seniors anymore.
Mm-hmm. I did feel really alone when it happened. There's a lot going on. Everyone has a lot going on. But again, because it hit so differently, I was feeling a certain way. And I know that, like, my Asian mom group text was going off, one Asian mom particularly, who was also processing it. Our group text was going off of, the AAPI, where y'all really from group text is going off. And then also the AAPI ERG that I'm a part of at work, we came together in this space. But I did feel like, where was everyone else? And I felt like, why hadn't people reached out to us? And and again, and I know there's like some, and I know that I'm not like, I shouldn't expect that from people, but there was something about it where I was like, why aren't you all seeing my pain? Like, why aren't you seeing that, like, this is upsetting to us and that we don't know how to process it and no one's reaching out to see if we are okay?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the reasons is because it's really difficult to categorize. It doesn't just fall into a neat little bucket where this is a young white man that's, another sort of pattern. It does not fit the pattern. And so we don't, is this a hate crime? Is this an act of violence against just an individual that's more personal? Is it something that is part of a larger pattern that is emerging? We don't know any of that, but for like the media and people even in the Asian community, but certainly outside the Asian community, it's, is this something that can be categorized as an act of hate against a particular community? And because it was perpetrated by elders within that community, the answer was no. And so we moved on because that's not the story. So the nuances of this, I think, are something that we're just going to have to process and figure out ourselves because it's not going to happen externally. And so I think you're absolutely right that where is that discussion? Where is that larger discussion about what actually happened and why? That is something that has been left entirely, I think, to the AAPI community because within the larger community, sort of their obligation and their sense of responsibility is done.
Right.
And that, in my opinion.
Well, no, it's true. And I do think that is a part of that. But that at the same time, it's like, who are your true allies? And maybe I have my answer. Maybe we have our answer where like we have to just take care of ourselves. I don't want to believe that though. I want to believe that there are other allies outside of our community that do care for us and really want us to be cared for. And I think that might just be another episode altogether. But I do think that was another layer to this that I was hoping to, that I'm still trying to process of what that means for people to show up for us who are often quiet and don't want to cause, alarm bells or are not very vocal about our feelings and are seen as like that model minority. And so we're going to like go inside of ourselves and process internally. I just want to break that idea of us and know that, okay, we're still here, we're processing, we're in pain right now. Please show up for us in these ways. Or I just ask us if we're okay, acknowledge that we're in pain. So I don't know, that it's just another layer of this that again, I'm just trying to figure out and articulate and trying to figure out what that means. But I know that it is like another data point of this whole week, I think.
It is. And I mean, honestly, I think it's an opportunity for, as we as a community work through some of these things and figure it out for ourselves, how we're going to be moving forward, why this happened. I think it's an opportunity because people just may not know to ask, right? It's not necessarily an intentional thing or a deliberate thing. It's just, we can tell them this is what is going on and this is where you need to be in terms of supporting us as we ourselves process this, because it's not falling into a category or pattern that anybody is familiar with. And so I think it's a way to, I think you're right, not to just process it internally and then be silent about it, but to go through it, process it within the community, within yourselves, within ourselves, and then talk about it with everybody, with allies, with friends, with folks that are not AAPI, other AAPI communities, so that we don't let the silence and the stigma overtake the conversation again.
We talked a lot about heavy things today. So if you are listening and need some resources, we are building out a list of resources on whereyallreallyfrom.org. There you'll find some links to a few mental health resources.
Support for the Louisville Public Media podcast incubator comes from the Community Foundation of Louisville, helping donors in our community establish charitable funds to meet philanthropic goals, creating opportunities to give more through scholarship, charitable checking, and donor-advised funds, and helping donors create a charitable legacy through their estate plan. More at cflouisville.org. Find what's happening in Louisville, all in one online destination. Visit thenewlpm.org for daily news, music, newsletters, podcasts, events, and more from LPM, Louisville Public Media.